Now, the lesson that I developed on this series, Pandemics, more or less, with a question mark, I'm really asking a question. Will there be more pandemics or less? Well, in comparison to what? And if you've been with me over the last weeks, or if you've seen the online follow-up, you know that I point out that in 1918, we had a pandemic, the Spanish flu. They don't know how many millions died as a result. You get numbers all the way up to 60 million. HIV/AIDS pandemic started really in 1984. Some people put it 82, but by 84, it was in a full-blown pandemic. And since 1984, we've seen somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 million people have died as a result of complications from the virus. 2009, of course, we had the H1N1. Was a pandemic, stretched over a year, did significant damage to the human population. And then in 2019, we have SARS, coronavirus 2. It is, in fact, a mutation from the 2003 virus that did damage in Europe and Asia for sure. This is a second blast of that, starting in 2019 and now, of course, running into 2020. COVID-19 is the disease that is caused by the SARS coronavirus 2. So you see, in the last 100 years, there were basically 4 pandemics. So compared to 100 years previous, I'm asking the questions, in the next 100 years, is there a possibility there will be more pandemics or less? Very interesting, from 1918 to 1984, about 65 years, we did not have a pandemic. And then in 1984 to 2009, about 25 years between the beginning of the AIDS epidemic or pandemic, and then only 10 years difference between the H1N1 and the SARS coronavirus 2. The frequency is certainly a declining number. Is there potential that there are going to be more frequent pandemics in our future in distinction from our past? And if so, what would be the precipitating factors that might influence that? I told you that I believe that there is a possibility of a perfect storm. A perfect storm would involve the coming together of elements that could make a pandemic unparalleled in previous human history. And that would have to be doing a lot, because we've had some rather serious viruses shriek this earth over the past 2,000 years. I tried to inform you about superbugs, one of the pillars or legs of my 3-leg stool that could potentially be a part of a perfect storm. These superbugs are exploding. That is, they are mutating. Of the 21 that they are watching today, they have the capacity to explode if we have a mutation of one or several of them in a way that is unpredictable or unknown heretofore. Superbugs have developed the capacity to resist our strongest antibiotics. Most of them only have 1 or 2 antibiotics that are effective against them, and that is declining. You also need to know that air travel has made an epidemic, or a pandemic rather, a rather serious possibility. All of the cases in the United States were the direct result of someone traveling to the United States, bringing with them the SARS coronavirus either from China or from Europe, American citizens, or people who we had abroad who wanted to come home, or people who came here who from China that we did not know or understand at the first. And then the third leg of the stool that I think potentially could make a perfect storm is covenantal violations and God's response based on his character. An article I read this week, Berkeley Lovelace Jr. on CNBC. Now, I read everything with a grain of salt from these people, but I found this particular article. He said the coronavirus has mutated and appears to be more contagious now. A new study is finding the SARS coronavirus 2 cousin of SARS of the 2003. To date, this article pointed out that to date, researchers have identified 14 mutations of the coronavirus. I actually, there are more, but this guy says there were 14. And what is really interesting is that 30% of the DNA structure of the original coronavirus has fallen off, broken off. It's 70% of it is to the original, and yet it is more contagious. This is very interesting. Now, the point that I was making about superbugs and their ability to mutate is really the issue that is frightening, or could be frightening, because we don't know how these mutations will work. We don't know what the results will be. And right now, we don't have antibiotics to resist many of the 21. So very, very cautiously saying we need to be on the lookout. I told you that God has international covenants versus national covenants. We looked at an international covenant, which was the last one God made with humanity in Genesis. He made with Noah. He commanded Noah to fill the earth, number one. Number two, don't eat blood. And number three, punish murderers with death. Now, interestingly, if humanity and the Noahic Covenant is with humanity, it is not a lost or saved. It has nothing to do with whether you're lost or saved. It has to do with the fact that humanity is under a covenant with God to see life as precious and to protect it, because that's really what the Noahic Covenant is about. It's about life, producing it, multiply, fill the earth, no limitation on how many people could be born on the earth. We were told to fill it. We were told that if a murderer occurs, that the murderer is to be put to death. And yet you and I know that around the world, every day, seemingly, some new law is made to offset these commands of God, not only with abortion, but with gay marriage, with gender bending, and all the other aberrant behaviors that really smack at this problem. I was reading a book this week, sociologists looking at the countries in the world that reduced the number of babies being born to their detriment. And he listed these countries, and one of the countries that he listed was fascinating to me. The Iranians have decided that their women are not going to be having 8, 9, 10 babies. And the women, I guess, decided culturally, many of them are going to have 1 or 2, and they're going to have them in their 30s. The problem is now that they have a generation of this, the birth rate is so low that if every Iranian woman got pregnant, it would not be enough to turn the tide on the destruction of the Iranian population. And it's not just Iran, it's Turkey, it's Japan, it's Sweden. These countries, in adopting these policies not to have children, have actually assigned themselves to a death warrant. In fact, in Japan, they're paying couples to have children. They're paying couples to have children because they see that the population decline is going to be so dramatic because the birth rate is not keeping up at all to maintain the population. And this is a direct result of people deciding that babies were not first priority of humanity. And there were other consequences in the book. I found it very fascinating. Countries every day are making laws that we don't punish murderers with death. We recognize mitigation. And these are direct, insubordinate behaviors to the commands of God. Now, obviously, the question is, how long will God allow this? We looked in a national covenant, the Mosaic covenant, and the consequences of disobedience, and it, of course, outlines 5 cycles of discipline. We looked at that first one, and we said that when God starts dealing with a people, he starts with physical health. And the word panic, we talked about that. You can go back and listen to last week. Wasting disease and fevers that cause the body to melt away. Death slowly as the body decreases. 250-pound man going to 100 pounds, 120 pounds before he dies. Nothing but skin and bones. And this is God's way of saying, stop, turn around. He takes away physical health, national health, and then psychological health. And this is just the first cycle, ladies and gentlemen. So the question is, how long before judgment comes? Now, let's say that God is going to send some judgment. Now, please understand, I don't believe that God will send judgment and not let us know it's from him. He might. I mean, God can do whatever he wants, but it seems like to me it serves no purpose if society doesn't know that it is God that is doing it, particularly as society become even more hostile to God. And every example I studied in the Old Testament, God sent a prophet, even if it was not his people. He sent Jonah to a people that was not his to warn them of impending judgment. He sent a prophet to Edom, although Edom was cousin, to warn him. So if God is going to send judgment that is in response to a covenant, a national covenant, it seems to me that in some way he would let us know that it is from him. So I looked at all of the judgments in the Old Testament that were the result of covenant and how long God allowed it to go on before he stepped in with judgment. For example, from creation to the flood was 1,657 years. That's lunar. Okay, lunar years, very important. You'll get a very different outcome if you count it on a Western calendar. But on a lunar calendar, from the first day of the first month of the first year, creation, until the time of the flood, 1,657 years. Now, that's a long time for God to allow the society, and by the way, the flood was a international covenant. The consequences of disobedience, God allowed it to go on 1,657 years. From the flood to Sodom, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was 371 years. 371 years after the flood, a city, Sodom and Gomorrah, a region, had progressed to such an extent that it required a judgment of God, severe, and it was 371 years from the time 8 people walked off the ark until a city and region had grown so wicked that God had to respond with judgment. 371 years. The fall of Samaria, from the children of Israel coming out of Egypt until God brought the Assyrians to take away Samaria, or the 10 northern tribes. We're looking at 1,176 lunar years. That's how long he allowed Israel to go its way, for all intent and purposes, because they had a problem that they couldn't find any good kings. And none of the kings of Israel were ever reported to be good once these separate kingdoms started. So 1,000 years, 1,100 years, he allowed that nation, and there was a national covenant there. From the fall of Samaria until the fall of Judah was 129 years. God spared Judah 129 years before he sent Judah into captivity by the Babylonians. 129 years. Now, interestingly, the fall of Jerusalem the second time, from the time it was rebuilt, 49 years after Cyrus allowed the Jews to go back, 49 years later, Nehemiah went, restored the walls, which was the finishing of the building of the city. 434 years later, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. It was 434 years. Prophetic years, by the way, not lunar, because from the day Cyrus set the Jews free, God moved from a lunar calendar to a prophetic calendar. Prophetic calendar is 12 months, 30-day months. Okay? That is the way time is counted today on the prophetic calendar. Okay? So 434 years, which God, of course, told them in the prophecy of Daniel chapter 9. So Israel was judged on the basis of a national covenant. So was Israel, the 10 northern tribes. Now the question is, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a long time since God judged the nation on the basis of his international covenant, which forces me to ask the question, how long before judgment comes? I think it's going to involve two things. We're talking about either temporal judgment or eschatological judgment. Now, I'm kind of inclined to believe that it's been so long since God set the Noahic Covenant in place that if God is going to judge mankind for violations of the covenant, that judgment is probably going to be eschatological. Now, I could be wrong, but it's just been so long. And the feeling that I have, just in general, can't prove it, that we have come close to the eschatological end. Just as I'm looking at some things, I'm saying, for God to come with a temporal judgment at this point and it not be connected with the eschatological judgment, the summing up of all things, might. God's free to do what he wants. But it just seems to me that when he comes in punishment of breaking his covenant with Noah, he's going to do more than just a temporal judgment. That in fact, he's going to come in eschatological judgment, which is a summing up of all things. Now, I know that most people, that's kind of how we play it anyway. You listen to all the prophets out there, they're telling you that the end of doom is here, it's coming. I always speak with caution because God can change, he can go different directions. It can look like the end is any moment. I mean, just going to break loose, and then history can turn and go a separate way. So I don't want to be on that wagon that says this is it, but I'm just saying at some point God is going to judge humanity for violating his covenant, the Noahic Covenant. Now, one of the things that I want you to always remember is that the end time sequence is not going to happen in a vacuum. And by that, I mean, you're not going to just wake up, you're not going to go to sleep one night and wake up the next day and everything totally changed. It's just not going to happen that way. Human beings don't work that way without an awful lot of persuading. Okay, I think it's going to gradually, as God has allowed it, it's going to gradually get worse until the climate is right for a guy to come and propose world government of one. And one of the traits or characteristics that I'm watching is lawlessness. And there are 3 scriptures that are of particular interest to me. And one of them is Matthew 24:12. Jesus says that because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. So he's describing events in the second half of Daniel's final week. And he says one characteristic of it is lawlessness, that there will be no justice. You will have no court, no police, no army committed to law as we know it. In fact, it'll be just the opposite, which is why I say this won't happen in a vacuum. I don't think you're just going to wake up one day and the world is lawless. I think over time, it's going to slowly wax that way. And we've come a long way, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, in the last 6 weeks, I've seen unparalleled lawlessness, or at least not abiding by the laws as we understand them, even here in our country. So Jesus says there's going to come lawlessness, and it's worldwide. It's not just one country. It's not just Europe. It's the world. It's lawless. There is no justice. Now, you couple that with Paul, who says in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come, day of the Lord, unless the rebellion come first and the man of lawlessness is revealed. In other words, Jesus said there's going to be unparalleled lawlessness, and Paul tells us that there's going to be a man who is the principal driver of lawlessness. The man of lawlessness, the son of destruction. He opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God, an object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. In other words, the ultimate act of anomia, lawless. So not only is there a philosophy of lawlessness, there is a leader who is the exponent or driver of it. And Paul goes on to tell us in verse 7, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. So there is a spirit of lawlessness that is going to be driven by the man of lawlessness who drives a philosophy of lawlessness. So as you look around and as you look at your world, and if you look at your country and the countries of the world, watch how fast countries move towards lawlessness. This is not the simple breaking of God's law, the law of Moses. It's not what he's talking about. He's talking about the absolute objective of perverting the laws of nature, the laws of right and wrong, the laws of good and evil. All of this, because nature has a way of responding to lawlessness, and is usually some kind of disease, which is why I'm convinced that there may be more pandemics in our future than was in our past. The mystery of lawlessness, the spirit of anti-God, anti-righteous, driven by a man that the world adopts. And we've certainly seen it in the last 4 years. We've seen a lawlessness unparalleled in the history of this country that is actually promoted and preached and accepted by the media as legit. There are lots of things for you to be watching. Most of the things that the world tells you is not worth your time. Whether there's going to be 3 full moons or 15 moons or 3 red moons or what, all this stuff, that's really not what you need to be watching. You need to be watching how man more and more is walking in lockstep with a dominant government that tells him everything he can or cannot do. The more accepting of that, the more lawless society will be, and the less likely that you will be able to get justice when you've done wrong. Because what they do to you will not be considered wrong. This is our challenge today. Hey, don't forget, June 7th coming, we'll start talking about the sovereign administration of God. In the Bible, you read it as kingdom of God. But I want you to know that there's something far deeper and much more significant about what God is doing. That the kingdom is organic, it is growing, and that its growth has in fact circled the globe. The rock that was a pebble is a mountain filling the earth, exactly as Daniel 2 said.